Welcome back to Dr. B Music Theory. I'm going to check my computer to make sure this stream is coming through correctly. So if you give me one moment just to make sure the technical side is taken care of. It looks like we are in luck. I see the video titled The Beach Boys and Baroque Dances. Dr. B Music Theory looks like it is up and running. So that is great. So these live Q&As that I'm doing right here are often started off with questions that I did not have a chance to answer from a previous video. So if you're watching all of my videos in order, you're going to be able to see that someone asked in the chat about Brian Wilson's Smile. And they asked for, I don't know, over a month, a couple, 3 or 4 videos in a row. They were asking about that, and I kept saying, "Oh, I'll check it out. I'll check it out." I finally had time, and I finally had a chance to listen to it. So I'm going to be happy to share that. Had another person who was asking about Baroque dances and how to write Baroque dances. So I did a little research on that. After I'm done presenting and answering these questions, I'm happy to take on new questions from all of you. And so I'll be checking the chat, and I can kind of see what everyone is typing there, and hopefully we can do some back and forth and answer some of your music theory questions. So let's get started. So Brian Wilson was a member of the Beach Boys, really popular group back in the late 60s. So in 1967, they started recording an album, but they never completed it. And some of the songs kind of like stayed around, and there was like bootleg versions of it, and fans of the Beach Boys wanted to hear it more. And so what Brian Wilson did is, in his own kind of group, not with the official Beach Boys, but separately under his own name, he kind of, with a lot of prodding and encouragement, brought back that music, did a couple of live concerts, and then decided to record a whole album all the way in 2004. So 1967, unfinished album, 2004, finished album. And so it's a pretty big concept album, and I'm going to just pull up some of my notes here on the side, so forgive me as I look not directly into the camera here for a moment, but I just wanted to remind myself of some of the things that I had that I wanted to share with you all. So it's definitely worth listening to, and it's very interesting as a concept album that has lots of small pieces, often connected. So there's frequent segues from one song to the next, and they're connected with no interruption, no pause. So it sometimes has a feel of almost like a classical multi-movement work. It uses a lot of has a lot of your kind of traditional rock band instruments, but it also introduces clarinet, trombone, trumpet, and so in a certain sense, it has a little bit of a feel of like the Beatles' White Album, where you have these orchestral instruments that are used for color, and there's an emphasis on a more compositional, formal, large-scale feel. Some of the pieces come back later on in the album, but with the variations. So it's kind of interesting. So the opening is called Our Prayer, and we're going to take a look here at the first 4 measures of this, and it's all a cappella vocals. It then kind of goes into more traditional song type format. I particularly like the second song called Heroes and Villains, which is a fairly popular one, and it has a nice trombone introduction. And again, I'm as a fan of complexity in music and levels and variations, I appreciated the way it started. It then has the main kind of like beginning A section, and then it kind of like comes to a pause, and then it switches into a slower tempo. And this is very unusual for, let's say, a lot of popular music, especially popular music today, that you would actually have tempo changes. And this is one of the best tempo changes I've ever heard in like pop rock music. You're going along and it's kind of like Beach Boys, more of an up-tempo thing, and then it goes into this slower thing with the heroes and villains. And it's just like, whoa, it gives you this, and it's a very cool feeling. And then it has another kind of ending, and then transition back into the more up-tempo section. Now, one of the things that I think is worth noting is that some of these transitions are more of like what you would expect from a classical transition, where it kind of evolves the melody, and the others are more juxtaposition, where it's like stop, start, stop, start, and it's juxtaposed type of transitions. Many of them work great, and I think a few of them are not as effective as others if you're listening to the whole album. So if I were to be critical, that would be probably one of my things, is that some of the transitions don't seem as organic and natural and feel like a certain type of evolutionary flow, as opposed to a stop, start. And there doesn't always have to seem to be a particular logical progression from one to the other. That said, I definitely think it's worth listening to. Let me see some of my other. In Roll Plymouth Rock, there's these kind of awesome timpani part. So kettle drums, what we would hear in a Beethoven symphony. You hear this in kind of like a pop rock setting, which is kind of really interesting to hear. We have Song for Children uses clarinet, which is another one that particularly reminded me of some of the Beatles songs. Let's see what else really struck my eyes, or struck my ears rather, I should say. So I think that's a good initial impression. So let's take a look at what we have here, and we've got some interesting things that I would like to point out to you. So one, I'm posting Brian Wilson's handwritten copy of this on my Patreon page. So my Patreon page, what I use it for kind of in two different ways. One is for things that I talk about music here in my YouTube videos. It's a good place for me to use as an archiving of some of the sheet music and images. YouTube is not always as good for, I could embed it into the video, which would take me a little extra time as opposed to, in addition to doing the live. So I didn't really want to do that. This is a way for me to put the sheet music that you can then go and look at and kind of follow along with that sheet music and say, oh yeah, I see exactly what he's talking about. Because a lot of this, what I'm talking about, has a level of complexity that you might want to pause the video if you're watching it once it's archived. Obviously not now when it's live. But you can go to Patreon, look at my Patreon page, see some of the sheet music for things that I've discussed, along with some of my kind of tips that I put up there for free. Now, if you want to support me and throw me a little money, then there's some other things I have up there. So it's for two purposes. So please check there, because I'm going to post a lot of free stuff as well. And so you just can't lose by checking in there. So you can follow along. I have Brian Wilson's handwritten copy. I'm also going to put a link. If you go to YouTube, there's a guy who did a transcription along with the audio and his transcription. What's interesting, and I'm going to start pointing out some things that are curious. So the transcription that was done by someone else on YouTube was written with 6 flats. And it makes sense why they did that, because it's clearly an E flat minor. An E flat minor would have the relative major of G flat major, which would be 6 flats. So that makes a ton of sense why this transcription on YouTube would have 6 flats in the key signature. However, when you look at Brian Wilson's, you have only 5 flats, which is what I went with. But it's an E flat minor. So these are some of the things that, as you're analyzing a piece, whether you're a Beach Boys fan, you're interested in this piece, or you're just trying to hone your music theory analysis skills, look at key signatures, but don't, it's a starting spot. It's for saying, if I were to look at this and go, 5 flats, so I guess we must be in D flat major. I'm really confused why none of this makes sense. Well, maybe that key signature is not, exactly telling you that. Maybe it's telling you something a little different. And just like when you look at someone's transcription, just because you find something on YouTube or online doesn't mean it's accurate, especially when we're talking about music and music theory. People can do a great job, but, you know, mistakes can happen. Different interpretations that are either more or less valuable. So, you know, six flats is not wrong. I'm not going to criticize it, but what had to happen is in that transcription, they had to write in a lot of C naturals. And the C natural had to be written in a whole bunch of times. And we're going to talk about why I chose to go with this. And I guess I'll tell you right now. Because I think this is more of a E-flat Dorian. It's kind of a modal minor, as opposed to a real tonal minor. He uses a lot of B-flat minor triads instead of B-flat major as a 5 chord. So this is not your traditional E-flat minor. This is more of a modal E-flat minor. And so because of that, it's really kind of emphasizing more of a Dorian sound, which would have your C naturals. So honoring the more modal characteristics of this E-flat minor, I went with the key signature that Brian Wilson used. So that's one little interesting observation that I want to draw your attention to. So the other is that in the transcription, rhythmically, it's laid out very differently. And I again went with what Brian Wilson did as opposed to that. Now that transcription is super valuable because you can kind of listen and look at the notes and at the same time. So it's certainly valuable, and that's why I'm going to link to it in my video afterwards. But a couple things that you should just be aware of. And so when you're looking at that, one of the things that struck me as strange, and this will be criticism of his transcription, is that instead of fermatas, he kind of wrote out a measure of 4/4 and then a measure of 2/4 and in certain spots a measure of 5/4. It's just not the way it's really being felt. It's not being felt as 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 1 2 3 4. That's not the way it's being felt. It's being felt as 1 2 3 fermata. No need to add in a 2/4 measure to like kind of get the feel of that. And then continue, 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 right? And there's some other fermatas that I didn't bother writing all of them in this example on the board. You'll see it when you look at my Patreon page. But I think sometimes there's just when you're trying to understand phrasing, it's better to have it written out like this, where you can see, oh yeah, I see 4-measure phrases, everything's ending where you kind of expect them. And the feeling should be that of a fermata, not of metered time. So if we look at this, the very first sound we have, and I'm going to use the electric piano sound to kind of simulate the sustain of voices. So we get E flat down here, right? So you have this kind of, so it's a closed voicing up here. If we remember our voicings, closed voicing meaning that it's all tight, all in one hand. There's no members of the chord that are missing. And then down low, we got that E flat to give this kind of like nice bass feeling to it. And then as soon as we move after that, and that's nice and dissonant. It gets a little crunchy right away. So it gives it this kind of like, you get this minor, dramatic, almost epic feel, and then you get that tension, which is some of the really fun part of music, where you get the opening statement tension, and then it starts moving and flowing into all these different areas. So notice that we have 2 non-chord tones. What I'm going to analyze is 2 non-chord tones. I'm going to analyze the D flat as a passing tone. So step down, step in the same direction. And I'm going to analyze this F in the bass as a passing tone. Step up, step in the same direction. So and when you have simultaneous non-chord tones, you'll notice that they usually create either a third or a sixth intervallically. Because non-chord tone all by itself is dissonant. You don't want to make it even over the top dissonance and so dissonant that it's just ugly. by having that be very dissonant as well. So F to D flat is a 6. If we kind of look incidentally in order to try to analyze that beat 2, you might be tempted to call it a 3 major 4-2. Or you could say a G flat major 7 with the 7th in the bass. Now what's interesting is this idea of a triad with the 7th in the bass. I'm going to write that 7th in bass. Like this, I don't think it's really functioning that way, which is why I'm not going to call it a 3 major 4-2. I think it functions as passing tones, and it's just it's the one chord, and it just kind of like starts having the non-chord tones to create the dissonance. So I don't think it really functions like that. That said, if it were, you know, first off, 3 is almost never an inversion, even 3/7 chords. But on the other hand, to argue the other side, 1-3-4, which is where it's going, is a common progression. But it's interesting when we have kind of non-chord tones in this example. More than once, we have this triad with a 7th in the bass as the way in which the non-chord tones are used to kind of make sense. So I'm going to just call that 1, 2 passing tones, and then check this out. When I just said about the it's an A flat major triad with G flat in the bass. And you could say, Dr. B, that should be an A flat 7, major minor 7 chord. It's a 4/7. Why would you not call it that? Why would you call that passing tone? 2 passing tones in a row seems unusual. Well, remember that the 7th of a chord almost always resolves down. So the fact that this, you could say, oh, that G flat, it's an A flat 7, but because that G flat goes up, I actually think it's an accented passing tone. So it doesn't really matter that you have another non-chord tone that comes before it. It's 2 passing tones in a row. That's something that happens, you know, it's not uncommon. 1 passing tone in a row is more frequent, but that's not infrequent. So accented passing tone, the G flat, because it goes up instead of down, I don't think it functions as a 7th. I think it functions as a passing tone. And what that does is it gives us a major 4 chord. So if we think about Dorian, our normal kind of sonorities for our diatonic triads changes. Our 1 chord stays minor. Our 2 chord, instead of being diminished, is just minor. It's really scale degree 6 is where our difference. So any chord that has scale degree 6 is going to be different. So I'm going to put a box around 2 because it's different. Our 3 chord will stay major. Our 4 chord will be major, so that's different because that has a scale degree 6 in it. Our 5 chord, if we stay modal and we don't raise anything, will be a minor 5. Our 6 chord will not be based on a minor 6 above tonic. It'll be based on a major 6 above tonic. So we could simply call that, it's gonna be a diminished sonority. So some people might call that sharp 6 diminished to realize that it's not based on the flat 6. I'm just going to call it 6 because the way I use the key signature, which is one of the reasons I went with this key signature. So I'm just going to call that 6 diminished, and then 7 would be a subtonic 7, and that's kind of normal if we're not doing that. So we see that the 2 chord, the 4 chord, and the 6 chord would be different sonorities than what we would typically expect for traditional minor keys. And the 5 chord would also be, you could also say that the 5 chord's a little bit different as well because we're not typically raising the leading tone. But Brian Wilson does raise it a few times in here. So that's another thing that's, for those of you who are interested in writing more modal music, one of the things that you can do is stay modal for a good amount of time, and then every now and then go to the more traditional expected minor by introducing that raised leading tone to kind of give it more of a cadential, authentic cadence, culmination, end of a phrase, or just helping the flow in the middle of the music. So going back and forth between modal, a modal minor and a traditional minor is something that is very effective. So we get here, going back, we get to our major 4 chord, and then we finally end on our 1-6-4 chord. Now 1-6-4, you know, we normally don't use that unless it's very carefully prepared and resolved. And this is not one of the ways that we would typically use a second inversion triad. Passing 6-4, neighbor 6-4, cadential 6-4. This is none of them. Why does it work? Well, the power of the scale, right? If we look at this bass line, it's just going up a scale, and then we're going back to 1. So it's not so unusual that our ears can't make sense of it. So it works. So what happens next? Let me play that beginning again. The fermata, and then we go to, so it turns into a G flat major triad in first inversion with B flat in the bass, which I'm going to call a 3-6. Not all of this is going to, a lot of this, as you can see, is not going to follow your traditional classical rules. And that's okay. We're trying to look at this and say, well, what is it that's happening? How is it following the rules that we expect? How does it depart from our expectations? And that interplay between the expected and the unexpected is what makes music so interesting. So we get a 3 chord in first inversion. That's a bit unusual, right? Because normally 3 is found in root position. But our harmonic rhythm really starts to change here more towards the 8th note than half note, quarter, quarter, which is what we had in the first measure. That also is not super unusual. Often you have an opening statement that kind of presents things in more broad, rhythmic, like in longer note values, so this kind of broad feeling, and then it starts moving in the middle, and then slows down again at the end, which is exactly what we have in this 4-bar phrase. So we go to this 4-6, okay, so, and at first I said, oh, I'm going to analyze this C, and this E flat is a non-chord tone. But, you know, after looking at it, I was like, well, it's prepared by leap and step in the same direction. That doesn't fit any of the non-chord tones we expect. And here, this is step and then leap in the same direction. So, you know, it's like, it's not, again, not one of the non-chord tones. It's not an escape tone. It's like similar to an escape tone, but it jumps in the wrong direction. So then I thought, you know, maybe really what's happening is we're starting to accelerate the harmonic rhythm and just have everything move. So it's a C half diminished 7 with B flat in the bass. So this is really our 6th chord. And when we make it a 7th chord, it goes from being diminished to half diminished. So I'm going to call it 6 half diminished 4-2. We then move forward. So let me start on there again. Then the bass jumps down. Minor 5. Ending on an E flat major triad. So we go from G flat major triad with B flat in the bass to C half diminished 7 with B flat in the bass, B flat minor triad, B flat triad, and I'm going to talk to you what I think about this A flat here, and E flat major triad with E flat in the bass. So 3-6 to 6 half diminished 4-2 to a minor 5. That's pretty clear. Now this A flat with the D natural raised, it sounds like we're going from the minor 5 and we're turning it into a major 5. It actually sounds like a major 5-4-2 at first, because it's so common to have this kind of, right? descending bass line where that A flat becomes the 7th of the 5 chord and resolves down into a 1/6. That's what we would expect. It doesn't do that. So this A flat here, again, kind of what I was talking about with this 4 chord, it looks like it would be a 7th, but it doesn't resolve, so it doesn't really function like a 7th. It functions more like a neighbor tone. But this D natural and the fact that we had the B flat here on a strong beat immediately make it sound like we take that minor 5 chord and turn it into a major 5, and then we resolve to an E flat. What's interesting is that it's not E flat, and again we have this 6/4, which is unusual. Just like we talked about this minor 1/6/4 here, I called this a major 1/6/4. Again, unusual, but when you do something unusual and you repeat it, now it doesn't sound like you made a mistake. It sounds like it's intentional. So that's another tip for composers and arrangers and when you're analyzing things. If you do something unusual once, it just sounds weird and like a mistake. If you do something unusual a couple times, all of a sudden the listener knows on a subconscious level and possibly a conscious level that you meant it. And then they're going to say, well, if they meant it, let me try to figure out why. You, of course, have to, as a composer, want to make sure you have a good reason why you're doing that. Why are you not going minor 5, 5/4/2, 1/6? What is this? What is that? What feeling are you going for that's different? One other way that you could think about this, I really think it really functions as a 1/6/4 or sounds like a 1/6/4. But what's interesting is the where it's going to this major 4, you could say, oh, it's a secondary function. The idea of going from E flat minor to E flat major, the minor to the parallel major, is something that's commonly done. But that's also very common that you'll do that when you're going to use that to modulate to another key or as a secondary function, because it could be 5/6/4 of 4, and that's exactly where the next measure starts off on. So it's interesting that it can almost have a dual function, and sometimes that's what makes things, when you put something in an unusual, let's say, unusual inversion, you have this little bit of like question mark. And especially if you have something that's functioning like a 1 chord, but transformed into the parallel major, and at the same time also kind of functions as a secondary dominant of your next, where you're going. The instability of the inversion allows for this almost dual role of how that chord functions. So let's keep going. We go to a 4 chord, and then we go to a 5 chord, and then a 5/4/2 of 4 to 4/6 to 5/6 to 1 major to 7 subtonic 7 in first inversion. These two are passing tone in the bass and tenor. 2/6, 7 diminished 7 of 5, minor 5, or actually, yeah, minor 5, but with a suspension in the tenor. So I just narrated it. Let me do that again and kind of slow it down and point out some other things. So the Dorian kind of mode mixed, and if you look at my lesson on mode mixture, I talk a little bit more about how in a minor key having a major 4 chord is how that's typically used and how that's often called mode mixture. We then go to our major 5, which are more tonal, raised 5 with the D natural. Right here on beat 2, in Brian Wilson's score, he wrote a wrong note. He has it as just a G with no natural sign. But in the recording that he made, it's sung a G natural. And so this is another word of warning, and why it's important when you're studying music theory to also make sure you are developing your ears. The best thing you can do as a musician is to transcribe music you love. And by transcribe, I mean listen to it and write it out, using your ear to make sure what you're hearing is reflected in what's notated. Because if you were to just look at the Brian Wilson example as written out, you'd have a discrepancy. It's written as a G flat, but that's not actually what's performed. And even really good people who are doing transcriptions and putting stuff online, sometimes they make a mistake. So it is important for you as a musician to develop your ears so that you can verify that what you're hearing matches what's written. And it's a very valuable skill to develop those ear training skills. But we definitely have a G natural right here. So it's a 5-4-2 of 4 going to 4-6. So 4-5, 5-4-2 of 4 to 4-6. So 4 to 5, that's expected. This is backtracking. This is kind of like this 5 to back to 4. So it's basically 4-5, 4-5, 1, which is a very expected cadence. We have a little bit of a retrogression right here because 5 normally doesn't go to 4-6, but it kind of does as a variation of a deceptive resolution. So sometimes we have 5 go to 6. That's not that uncommon, and 5 going to 4-6 is a variation of that. So keep in mind, when I say something is uncommon, I don't mean uncommon in the musical world. I mean uncommon compared to what happens more frequently. I'm recognizing the fact that what I call uncommon happens fairly frequently, just not as frequently as something else. So maybe my terminology could be improved. This was actually a quick side story. I was just looking at, I got a comment on one of my videos from one of my Ask Dr. B episodes, and they were saying that there was just so many commercials that it really, and advertisements that it really distracted from the educational side of it. And I was like, I got a little bit frustrated because I thought I had checked to make sure that the advertisements that happen aren't happening too frequently, because I checked some of them and they were happening every 2 minutes. There was like an advertisement. I was like, that's insane. I said once every 10 minutes seems reasonable. More than that, and absolutely, it's super distracting. And he was right. They were in a place I didn't expect. So I started going through more of my videos and just double checking that there weren't an excessive number of advertisements. So thank you to those of you who, if you find a video that has like advertisements every 2-3 minutes, send me a comment, send me a message, let me know. I want to fix that. I don't want that up there like that. Every 10 minutes or so is kind of what I think is the reasonable amount. So please send. Thank you for the people who've done that in the past. But as I was going through and looking at it, I looked at one of my videos where I had analyzed a harmonic progression by a guy named Kashmir, and he actually had responded to the video. So someone had asked me a question about his song. So one of my subscribers saying, I don't understand this harmonic progression. So I analyzed his song. He must have seen it and watched it. He actually watched my whole video and then commented, which I thought, and this was like a year ago, and I hadn't even noticed it. I'm like, oh no, because I'm doing okay with subscribers, and thank you all for supporting me. He's got over 1 million subscribers. I'm not quite there yet. You guys can help me out with that, but he has a lot more than me. So I thought it was really awesome that he listened to my video. But he said, actually, 6 going to 7, in a minor key, major 6 going to subtonic 7. He said that's really common in music today, and I was saying that it was uncommon, and I think that bears some clarification because he's right and I'm right. We're both right, but we're talking in slightly different contexts. I'm saying, when I was saying that, I'm saying for like your traditional classical Bach, Mozart, Haydn expected tonal progression, 6 normally does not go to subtonic 7, right? So this 6 to 7 is not super common in that type of music. Now, in other styles of music, like what he's doing, yeah, 6 to 7, super, super common. So it's a matter of the context and what's expected by the ear. So 6 to 7 is very expected once you set that up, as is 6 going to 2 in a more tonal context. So I think all this, bears remembering. Some people would argue that a Roman numeral analysis for this style of music is not helpful at all, that it doesn't function that way, so you shouldn't do it. So, I analyzed it in terms of the lead sheet symbols, and I put in here a possible Roman numeral analysis, noting that not all of them are going to really be tonal and function that way. But I still think it's valuable to see where things go as we expect them and where they don't go. And when you're trying to figure out a piece of music that you like and figure out why you like it and extract the principles, you need to analyze it some way. So if you're not going to do it with Roman numerals, what are you going to use? And so in a piece like this, I think there's enough tonal characteristics that using a Roman numeral analysis is still helpful, with the caveat that some of the progressions aren't going to really make sense in terms of your traditional chart of harmonic progression. But 4, 5 to 4, 6 is actually, it's a little bit unexpected, but it's not that unexpected. Especially when we have this idea of the 4, we got 5, up a step, the power of the scale, up a scale. Again, we have that ascending scale, which is a very common element in music. So we have the 5, 4, 2 to 4 going to 4, 6, which is a very expected progression there. 5, 6. We have 1 as a major, as a major triad, not a minor triad. We then go to the subtonic 7. Right here, this note, this G flat right here. Let me tell you a little bit about that G flat. When I was preparing for this Q&A, that G flat, I kept listening to it, and I was having a hard time saying, was that really a G flat or was it a G natural? We have a G natural here in the soprano. We have a G natural here in the alto. And I kept listening to it, and I was like, is it really going back to a G flat there? And, the music is fairly thick and dense, and I was like, I wasn't sure. I was like, I wasn't convinced that it was a G flat. I wasn't convinced that it was a G natural. I was uncertain. In terms of tonal music, the expectation in terms of the progression would be that it turns to a G natural, right? Right? I would expect. I would not expect. Especially because G natural had been introduced so like just a split second ago, G natural was in my ear. So I'd expect it to stay G natural. We kind of have the ascending, almost like ascending melodic minor, where you expect things to kind of just like the D natural goes up to the E flat by half step, I would expect the G natural to go up to the A flat by half step. So I actually ended up calling up a friend of mine and be like, double check with me. Let's check it. And we both kind of decided that, yeah, it is a G flat. It is written. But, Brian made a mistake here on the G natural here. Maybe there was another mistake. We decided, no, that G flat is good. But it's a little unexpected. And part of what we're doing here and what I'm trying to do is point out the expected and the unexpected. And if you want to take it to the next level, you can then say, well, do we like that unexpected? Do we think it actually makes the music more interesting and better? Or would it have been preferable to go with the expected? Would it be better? And I haven't thought this through. I'm doing this on the fly with you all here. Would it be better for that to be a G natural as opposed to a G flat? So let me play it first as it is, a G flat. I'm going to play it nice and slow from the beginning of the measure. So we get. So that's with the G flat. Now I'm going to do it and make it a G natural. And you tell me whether you think which one you like better. actually think Brian Wilson made the right choice with the G flat, even though these G naturals are there, and that it's a little bit unusual. I think I like the G flat better. But these are the kind of questions you should have with yourself as a composer. Excuse me. Moving on, 2 to 5 is an expected progression. Inserting a secondary 7th chord this is a textbook. The thing that's not textbook is that it's a minor 5 chord as opposed to a major 5 chord, but that gives it that modal flavor that we kind of start with. So, and this is just the beginning of it, right? I just wanted to give you an introduction to that piece and my thoughts about it, because I thought it was a really great way to open up an album with this kind of epic a cappella choral, very, very much inspired by the types of things I talk about in the classroom when discussing music theory. So, let me just turn here to the chat and see if we have any immediate questions on this before I move on to talking about Baroque dances. So, all right. Got some people saying hello. Yeah, I still haven't figured out how to send out the notifications ahead of time. Hey, Andrew Norris, welcome back. I just watched your video on the wildflower meadow and getting it ready for the winter, and I enjoyed the music that you put in there as well. Thank you. Yeah, Life of Brian. You're very welcome. You're very welcome. I have a hard time answering questions like really quickly. Usually when something catches my ear, I end up immersing myself. So I would listen to the album over. I didn't listen to it straight, which is really the way it should be listened to. I listened to it in 2 different pieces, and so there's some like. This is the kind of music that warrants more than one listening, and I did listen to some songs more than once, but I didn't listen to it all in one stretch. So sometimes where my initial impression is that some of the transitions were slightly awkward, that might change if I were to listen to it all in one sitting. It might hold together better, and the transitions and the juxtapositions kind of resonate and make a little bit more sense. So take that with I put that out there as only a first impression. But yeah, I enjoyed listening to it. Caleb here is talking about analyzing some Bach chorales and that he sometimes starts with a pickup note and sometimes he doesn't. Why is that? Why would a composer do that? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I'll come back to that. Yeah, Life of Brian. Yeah, the density of counterpoint. I think if you like that, if you haven't listened to like Jethro Tull, Thick as a Brick, or Aqualung, Ian Anderson is this amazing guy, singer, flute player, and the way he plays flute is not your traditional way of playing flute, but he does some really awesome stuff. I think some of the early albums by Yes, with songs like Roundabout, some Pink Floyd albums, I think have, maybe not Pink Floyd, but more of like Yes and Jethro Tull, because Jethro Tull's a flute player. He studied this classical music, and so that stuff kind of seeps into the composition. So I would recommend Jethro Tull and Yes and some of their music as examples in a rock style that have this more density of counterpoint. But again, this one is unique, and I grant you that. I listened to it, I was like, ooh. And the tempo changes. That's the thing that I like, and certainly in Hero and Villains, that tempo change thing. I was like, oh, that is a nice. Some Latin music, like Brazilian music, will do that too, where they'll shift meters or shift tempos in the middle of an otherwise metrical dance-like song. And I just think that's a really interesting thing to explore in music. So I urge you all to investigate as many musics from different styles and cultures as you can and find out what you really enjoy. So Yeah, Surf's Up was another. I think Surf's Up worked out pretty well. It was interesting. Since we're talking about criticisms that are legit, there were I the what was it? What was it? Something O'Leary's Cabin or something like that. I'm trying to remember the name of the title of that song. Mrs. O'Leary's Cow. That's what it was. I think that was, if I'm remembering what I read, that won a Grammy as an instrumental. And I can't help but think to myself that if that was just done by a up and coming band that no one had heard of before, there's no way it would have won a Grammy for it. But because it was Brian Wilson, who had a long and respected career and was beloved, that the people on the Grammy committee voted. They're like, oh, it's so avant-garde, it's so unique, it's so, and that's one of the tracks that does not work for me. It sounds like a throwback to what people thought was avant-garde 30 years ago. And I don't think it's withstood the test of time. And I think it only won because of the context of the album as a whole, which I think is much stronger than that track alone. So that's another word of warning especially with a concept album. There might be certain tracks that if you take it out of context, you'd be like, what is this? But when you put it in the context of the whole, it does make a little bit more sense there. So I'll give it credit there. All right. Well, that was it. Thank you for recommending it, because I'd never heard that, and it was really a really interesting listen. All right, so I'm gonna talk a little bit now about Baroque dances, because I had a question about that. So I'm gonna erase it, and again, it always hurts my heart. It's a masterpiece, but it's been saved on video, so we can all go back to it. The best way to learn, the question was, how do you write Baroque dances? And the best answer has to do with something I said just at the beginning of this video, which was, you should transcribe. You should listen to music that you love and write it out by ear and make sure you understand it that way. And the same is going to be true with Baroque dances. The best thing you could do is go listen to some Baroque dances, look at the sheet music, and try to then extrapolate what are the essential aspects of each Baroque dance, and then try to compose something using those essential items. So what I'm going to do when the video's done is I'm going to put a link to some of Bach's English suites, which are all kind of Baroque dance suites. And when I say Baroque, for those of you who don't know, we're talking about essentially 1600 to 1750 Western European people like Johann Sebastian Bach, George Friedrich Handel. These are some of the big name composers from that time period. And this was called the Baroque era, spelled Baroque. So the Baroque era. And they had these dances. They didn't have the chicken dance or the electric slide or any of that. They had their own dances. And what people like Bach would do is he would do a stylized version. And what does that mean? So stylized means that it's taking the essential aspects of the dance, mainly rhythmic, meter, tempo, and it's doing a more elevated, sophisticated version. So think of the word stylized as meaning sophisticated. So it might not be the actual dance. He's not, so Bach isn't actually writing the dance that the people in the village square would actually dance to. He's doing the more sophisticated, educated, stylized version of that dance. So it would be I guess it would be hilarious if someone were to do that with the electric slide or the chicken dance. Do a stylized version of that. or of any of the kind of dances that are popular like now, or that you would hear at a wedding. Do that stylized, more sophisticated version. I don't know if anyone's done that. I'm sure someone must have. And if they haven't, you can steal the idea from me and make it happen. Just give me a shout out to Dr. B Music Theory when you become famous. So this is what Bach, Handel, a lot of these Baroque composers were doing, is they were taking popular dances and then doing a more sophisticated version that was meant more for just listening as opposed to dancing. So number one, listen to them, and I'm going to put a link because it has it being played on piano, which is not historically accurate, so don't be too offended. Piano was not really invented until the end of the Baroque era, and did not become popular until really the classical era, time of Mozart and Haydn. But in terms of listening to great versions of it, it's a great performance performed on piano. It would typically have probably been performed on harpsichord, which is a keyboard instrument similar to the piano, but with a very different mechanism and a very different sound. So let's take a look, and I kind of have a little chart here for you, and these are the Baroque dances, and I challenge you to kind of, you composers out there, to write a jig, a courant, a minuet, a sarabande, an allemande, and a gavotte. Now, these are not in the order that they would normally occur in a dance suite. There's often a specific order or rough order of how these would occur. So I'm not talking about that right now. You can look at that when you look at the link for the Bach examples. The reason I put it in this order is I kind of tried to put them together, the ones that are similar, close together. So this is the name of the dance, right? The first thing is the meter. Okay? Is it 3/4, 2/4, 4/4, 12/8? What is the meter that is typically used? So for a jig, it is usually 12/8 or 6/8, which means it's a compound meter. Compound meter means it has 3 subdivisions within the beat. So it would be something like this. 1 and a 2 and a 1 and a 2 and a. That's 6/8. 1 and a 2 and a 1 and a 2 and a. I know it's a little confusing. Look at my video on meter. You could also count it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But you'll notice my snap, sometimes called the big beat, is 1, 2, 1, 2, 1 and a 2 and a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 12/8. 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4 and a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this is the idea of a simple meter versus a compound meter. These are compound meters, which means it has you have the pulse that you feel, what you would actually dance to, and within that pulse, there's 3 subdivisions. That's what compound meter means. And that's the way a jig is usually structured. It has that. The tempo is usually, is a fast tempo. The other thing, for some of you out there who are saying, I don't want to be a composer, Dr. B, I'm just trying to pass my music theory class. Or in this case, this would help you pass your music history class, because a music history class is going to talk about these Baroque dances. Then pay attention for music history. If you're a performer, this is valuable too, because when you have things like fast, the question is how fast? And if you want to, as you see these tempos will be different for these different dances, sometimes I've heard performances where the courant, which is supposed to be a medium tempo, is the same speed as the jig. And I think to myself, well, that's a little confusing if I'm trying to distinguish the different dances and the feel of them, that the courant and the jig are at the same speed. Perhaps that's not a good performance choice. And so as a performer, you want to make sure that if you're performing Baroque dance suites, that you're capturing the right tempo for that dance such that it can be distinguished from the other dances that have similar tempo. So this has a medium tempo, and a courant is usually in 3/2. If this was too fast, it could sound like 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 and sound like a jig. So this is why I'm making a point that for you performers who might ever, as a guitarist, classical guitarists love to play dance suites. All the John Dowland music that he wrote for lute, beautiful stuff. And that tradition is kind of, this goes in with that tradition. There's also kind of the character that is typically what you want to capture. So for a jig, you often have kind of continuous eighths. And it has that has this kind of like, that kind of flowing, energetic dance feel to it, okay? A courant almost always starts with an upbeat. So an eighth note pickup, which goes to one of the questions in the chat that I promised I'd get back to. Why start with a pickup? Why not just start on the downbeat? Well, certainly the Baroque dances would have, some of them would start right on downbeats and some of them would have pickups. So if you're just following the tradition, you'd say, well, why do you do that? Well, because that's what everyone else did, tradition, which is a reason people do certain things. But from a musical standpoint, what's the difference? If you think about a dance, if you're going to make your first step, there's like a begin, right? You have to lift the foot before you can put it down. So there's a kind of like, the idea of a pickup is like almost a preparation for something to start. So if we have dum bum ba dum bum 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 bum, right? There's like bum bum or da dum, and it gives it a little emphasis, right? It gives it emotionally a different feeling than going da 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 or dun dun dun. There's a little definitive. It's almost like a little exclamation when you have a pickup. And so when you ask, well, why does Bach do that for some and not others? The answer is always gonna be because of the emotion he's trying to capture. And listen to a bunch of music that has pickups and say, well, how would it sound without the pickup? Emotionally speaking, not, let's, as musicians, we want to be in touch with our feelings. As human beings, we want to be in touch with our feelings. But doubly so as a musician, because that's kind of our job, is to express emotion and get people to feel stuff. So with that pickup, ba-da-da-dum, like it's like almost like a prep. It's like a rev up. And some things are kind of great to be like, curtain opens. Like that's like starting on a downbeat is like the curtain opens. There's no, you don't know when the curtain's going to open. You're sitting there, you're waiting for a show to start, and then all of a sudden, boom, and sound happens immediately. And that's kind of like, this massive, it becomes like a statement, like stone, like here it is. Whereas if you hear, before the curtain opens, you hear a timpani roll, then the curtain opens. There's like this sense of expectation that starts to happen. There's like emphasis. So think about how the emotion changes whether you have a pickup or not. And a courant almost always has an eighth note pickup to this 3/2 tempo. So that's kind of like, it has this kind of, this preparation, this expectation in its character. A minuet is in 3/4, is a medium tempo, and is usually considered very elegant. Notice that this is more of a musical characteristic, and this is more of a descriptive, emotional characteristic. Do you see how like 3/4 and 3/2, like that's easily confused if you're listening, and that's a great challenge. Listen to some Baroque dances, and this is what I do with my history class. I basically tell them what all these are, and then I say, we're going to listen to one. And I don't tell them which one, and I say, which one do you think it was? Based on what you heard, based on figuring out the meter, looking at the tempo, and examining the character. And it's a great test. See how well you can do that. Have someone test you. Get a friend to be like, okay, pick one, don't tell me which it is, and play it. And let's see if I can figure it out based on these characteristics that I'm aware of. So a minuet, it's a medium tempo. It's more elegant than the courant. The courant has a little bit more energy, a little bit more expectation in it. And with 3/2, they're both going to be counted 1, 2, 3. They're both going to have a duple subdivision, 1 and 2 and 3 and. But 3/2 often has slightly faster moving rhythms than 3/4. And so keep in mind that there's a difference between tempo and the rhythms that you'd hear within that. So the rhythms here are often faster than in the minuet. The tempo is the same. The meter, they're both triple meter. They're both simple triple meter. But the rhythmic values in a courant is typically faster than those in a minuet. And so it ends up having a little bit more of an elegant feel. The sarabande is often in 3/4 or 3/2, right? So again, I'm trying to put these things next to each other to show you how you could get them confused. Like here, the meter here is the same as a minuet. The meter here is the same as a courant. These aren't always, but these are the most frequent. But here, the tempo is slow, and you have it's more of a dignified character, and there's an emphasis on beat 2. Again, as a performer, you want to make sure that this is slow enough that it's not confused with the minuet or the courant. So again, this is important as a performer to make sure you're capturing the right feel. Now, an allemande is typically in 4/4, and a gavotte is typically in cut time. We know that those sometimes are hard to distinguish metrically. They're both medium tempo, right? So these two are going to be hard to distinguish. Well, the allemande typically has a 16th note pickup and continuous rhythms, much like the jig. And the gavotte, typically every phrase starts on beat 2. So if we're going 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, dun 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 bum ba ba dum. So it's a pickup, right? It's a pickup, but it's like a half of a measure pickup, which is much more than this pickup and much more than the pickup here. It's a whole 2 beats. So what can happen as you're listening is you can mistakenly think that this, when it starts on beat 2, that's beat 1. You can mistake, like as a listener, you could actually be thinking, like, you don't necessarily know bop 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 bop. You don't know if that's 1 and a 2 and a 1 and a 2 or 2 and a 1 and a 2 and a 1. It's a little bit tricky. So listen carefully. Listen for when harmony changes. But be aware that this one is like a whole half of a measure pickup, whereas this is just a 16th note pickup typically. And this one has more continuous moving rhythms. And 4/4 has 1, 2, 3, 4. Has 4 pulses. Like it's loud, soft, medium loud, soft. So it would be written like that. And this has 1, 2. So the 1s line up, the 3 and the 2 line up. These are the ands, right? But you can see why cut time and 4/4 could be easily confused. So what you have to listen to is that these 2 and 4 should have a little bit more weight to them than these ands do. So that you can hear that there's really, it's loud, loud, something, 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 loud, something, 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 as opposed to loud something, loud something, loud something. The emphasis on one, to have the appropriate rhythmic emphasis on one, is what's going to distinguish 4/4 from cut time. So, if you kind of have this chart in mind, and then listen to some of Bach's English suites, which I'm going to put a link, and you can just look it up on YouTube and listen to that. The link I have is awesome because it has the timings for each movement and the name of it, so you can just be like, I want to check out Courant in Suite 1, the Courant in Suite 2, the Courant in Suite 3, et cetera, and compare. So it's really good. So the link I'm posting. I think Maria Pariah was the performer, the pianist. So if you're looking for it, I've had it before I have a chance to post it. That's what you will want to look for. Now there are other dances that are used in dance suites that I'm not putting in here, like the Baroque. Some use a chaconne. Sometimes you have something called a prelude, which is not an actual dance, but is like a setup. So there's more to talk about, but these are some of your more common dance forms that are typically found in a dance suite. So I hope that was useful for those of you who are interested in that. I'm going to now go back to the chat and see if I can answer some additional questions for folks. I'm going to remember to scroll down to the bottom in case something technical goes wrong. A couple videos ago, had a bunch of technical difficulties, batteries dying out, and me not realizing it. I promised myself I would always look at the end so that when you are all trying to help me, I can recognize that. But it looks like we're still doing great. So, Caleb, I think I answered I hope I answered your question about the Bach chorales, sometimes starting on a pickup note and sometimes doesn't. Again, getting a different feeling, like I said, the idea of that curtain, does the curtain open and the music start immediately, or is there a timpani roll before it, and how does that feel different? It does feel different, and I think that's why some will and some won't. The other thing you can do is don't forget, like my focus for music theory has been on an analysis of notes, rhythm, harmony, things like that. But when we're talking about a chorale, there are also lyrics. So you can always look to the lyrics to kind of say, well, what kind of emotion is he trying to capture with the music, with the lyrics? Most composers are going to have the music and the lyrics express the same emotion. That's the norm. That said, you can have juxtaposition where you have the lyrics that imply a certain feeling, and then you put some other music that's different than that underneath. So imagine this goes in either way. So imagine Mary Had a Little Lamb, which we expect to be all sweet and nursery rhyme and lulling children into sleep, and instead musically you put something very aggressive and dissonant under there, and you juxtapose those two things. That becomes a very different artistic statement than if the music supports the lyrics that you're there. So look towards the lyrics if you want to get some deeper insight there. Can we hear the music as a whole? So Bebop was asking, can we hear the music as a whole? So the answer is no. And the sad part of that is that the copyright laws that exist are exceedingly convoluted. And so if I share all this music here, then all of a sudden I'm going to get flagged for copyright infringement by YouTube. I don't want to run the risk. Sometimes they'll just say you're flagged and you can't make any money. That's no big deal. I wouldn't mind that. But I don't want to get flagged and then have my account put on probation. And if there's too many copyright violations, they sometimes take down an entire YouTube channel. And I just don't want to get even close to running the risk of doing that. So ideally, if this was a more ideal teaching situation, I would be playing you the music. I would be playing you these Baroque dances. I would be playing you excerpts from Brian Wilson's Smile, which is why the benefit of watching it live now is that you get to ask a question and we get to have some interaction. But the minus is that you don't get to pause it and go listen to the actual music I'm referring to, which is what you should do if you're listening to this after today. Go ahead, pause, and listen to some of that music. So my apologies. I'm just trying to stay safe for a copyright violation. It's almost like, if we look back musically to the Baroque era, since we were talking about that, it's like back in the good old days when there was no copyright, the way it would work is Bach would say, oh man, I really love the music of Vivaldi. I'm going to do my own arrangement of it, and I'm going to pay homage to this master. And copying someone's music was a sign of respect. And no one had a problem with it. It wasn't like, oh, Bach has taken the food off of Vivaldi's table. It's just not the way the economics of that worked. Now, with the way things are set up now, it's a little bit more complicated on terms of how copyright law should be, what it should be, what it shouldn't be. I don't think we've figured out the best version of intellectual property and copyright law. I think there should be. I think, artists should be compensated. They should be able to make a living from, if they produce something that's amazing that the world loves and wants to listen to, they should make some money for that. On the other hand, the idea of having this kind of being able to talk about that music, like in my sense, from an educational perspective, where the goal isn't for me to make money. I don't think Brian Wilson would lose any money by me playing his example in this video. And so if that's my basic rule, then I think the copyright laws should reflect that, such that I can present his music in an educational setting that probably would maybe get some people to want to go out and listen to his music that would not have otherwise listened to it. So I think there's room for improvement in copyright law as it currently exists, but that's why I'm not doing it. Long explanation, my apologies. In other words, I'm joining this class all the way from India and enjoy it. Ah, awesome, great. Oh, if you're, and so Bebopo, if you were talking about me playing it, my apologies. I erased everything now, so I think, unfortunately, that would be a little bit more complicated than I can do. Andrew North says, Yes and Jethro Tull, two of my favorite bands. Yeah, some of Yes's later stuff, they tried to get like really more appeal to different kind of audiences and almost a little bit more poppy, a little bit more commercial. But some of that earlier stuff, super innovative. They have a piece that's it's called, I think it's Brahms and Cans. So it's referencing Johannes Brahms, which, as you can see, I'm going for a Johannes Brahms beard look. So I'm a big fan of Brahms, and I'm a big fan of Yes because they're a big fan of Brahms. So yeah, I agree. I have another question. Great, thank you. Informative and helpful, that's what I'm going for. Thank you for the shout out, I appreciate it. We've got another comment here in the chat, talked about the seventh of the chord resolves down, half step, usually to the third of the next chord. Well, first off, let me clarify, it's not always a half step, it's down a step. If it's going to a minor triad, it might be a whole step. If it's going to a major triad, it's probably going to be a half step. But it depends. It depends on the kind of seventh, and it depends on the kind of chord it's going to. So there's two factors. So let me just qualify that. But let me keep reading. What are the usual rules for the 9th, 11th, and 13th of a chord? So great question. This is a really good question. So I'm going to erase all this. There's your Baroque dance information. And speaking of Jethro Tull, he's played some of these Baroque dances on his flute as part of his performances as well. So I think he has a piece called Baroque, which is a Baroque dance, not one of the ones I put up, but another type. So it's all connected, right? Music, it's wonderful to examine music and see how things all connect. So we're talking about the sevenths of chords. So if we go 1, 3, 5, 7, and the idea is that the seventh resolves down. That is correct. It's going to resolve usually if we're doing circle of fifths progressions. So let's just say C, E, G. Let's say let's make ourselves in the key of C. So let's say we got G, B, D, F. That's not. I wrote a 7 on an F. Typically, that is a 5/7 chord. Typically, it will go to 1, which would be C, E, G, which means that this F would move down a half step to the third of the 1 chord. But that's not always the way it's going to work out. That's the most common way, so I understand why you said that. But just imagine if it were C minor instead, and this goes in E flat. Now all of a sudden, that is a whole step to the third. you know, we could also have deceptive resolutions, like, right? We could be like, well, maybe this is going to go to A, C, E. It's going to be a 6th chord. We're going to go deceptive here. So now it's going to the 5th of the chord. So there's a number of permutations, but your basic understanding is correct. The 7th of a chord wants to resolve down. So your question is, if that's the case, 1, 3, 5, 7, what about the 9, 11, and 13? So the 9 would be an A, the 11 would be C, and the 13 would be an E. Let me make that so it looks like a 13 and not a B. So if this was the key of C, and we stayed in that key, we have, let me go back to piano sound now. That would be our 13th chord with all the upper structures. So 11, 9, 13, these are called upper structures. And this is if we just stacked them in thirds. It's actually sometimes more common that you don't necessarily have a closed voicing chord, so you might spread them out. Aaron Copland would certainly spread them out if he were doing it. You might spread it out more, give it so it opens up, because that C in particular can be a little bit dissonant, because if we say C to B, that's a minor ninth away. It's kind of dissonant. So spreading it out is one way to kind of soften the dissonance, make it sound a little bit better, but keep the richness of all those notes. Another thing that happens very often is you sometimes will alter some of these elements. So a sharp 11, making it a C sharp, is a really common thing. So think about 9, 11, 13. It kind of creates a triad of its own, right? Either an A minor triad or an A major triad in this case. So if we were to go A major triad, and that sharp 11 is actually a more common sound than the regular 11, again because of that dissonance of B to C natural being particularly dissonant. So that becomes more common. But we can also alter the 9. Make it a flat 9. You can make flat 13. You probably wouldn't alter the 13 and have the 5. So you might, if you alter the 13, you usually remove the 5. But I digress. The question was, if the 7th is typically going to resolve down by step, what are the 9, the 11, and the 13? What's up with those? Well, with upper structures, you really think about the voice leading. And smooth voice leading is key. So you move things by step. You really try to move things by step and resolve them. So there's not the same kind of like powerful tendency that the 7th has for the 9, the 11, and the 13th. 9 and 11, 13s, by their nature, feel like upper structures floating on top of a chord. So they, by their pure nature, feel like they float. And because they feel like they float, they don't have the urgency to resolve in a specific direction like the 7th does, like the leading tone of a key does. So if this is and we're key of C and this is a B and it's in an outer voice, it wants to resolve up, right? So the 7th and the 3rd, and even the root, have very strong tendencies. Roots like to go down a fifth, right? Down a perfect fifth. Leading tones like to go up a step. 7ths like to go down a step. All of these have very strong tendencies. But once we're into 9, 11, 13, we're kind of in floating area. We're in color. We're in like pizzazz area. And so when that happens, they don't have the the gravitational urgency that the other notes do. But you need to pay attention to voice leading. So you're going to try to want to move things by step. So let's say we had a, let's call it a G7, and I'm going to put some actual staves on the board here. Let's say we have a G7 sharp 11. So let's have a 9-11. And we're going to resolve it to a 1 chord, right? I'm going to treat it like a 5 chord, going to a 1 chord. So let's see here. Got bass clef, treble clef, C major. I'm going to put G, and I'm going to go B. I'll put D here, so I'll do it F, A, C sharp. So 3 notes in each 6-note chord. It's going to be a G7 sharp 11 as a lead sheet symbol, or 5. We would go sharp 11, 9, 7. I don't even know how you would Roman numeral put the Roman numeral analysis. To be honest, I'm not even sure if that's what you would put. But let's talk about how we would resolve that. We would want to go to a C, let's say C major. So let's say our C. Oops, sorry. I just noticed my mistake. Thank you. So I noticed there it is. There's our C. Our F wants to go to this E, right? And then I'm basically going to try to do smooth voice leading. That's critical. My leading tone's not an inner voice, so I'm probably going to move this B down to the G to kind of keep that feeling. This D will probably move to a C, so this will go C, G, C, E. The C sharp, I think I would want it to move down to the C natural, right? Because that's the closest thing. So it would go there. The A would move by step. So I try to move things by step whenever possible. Let's see what that would sound like. Now, I don't think that sounds particularly good. I think going from a 6-note chord to a 3-note chord, even though I'm doubling, but still only 3 different notes, is just it's just too much of a contrast. So unless I were to set that up some way, it sounds a little awkward. I would much rather I'd much rather keep those upper structure chords. And a C sharp, whenever I see the sharps tend to like to resolve up, so I'd love to make it a C9 chord. I could totally get on board with, maybe making it making this a B natural here. So these kind of move down in thirds. That moves down the step that we need. So I go to a 5-note chord. So I don't go from 6 to 3. I go 6 to 5. Right? And that sounds pretty nice. 2. Right? So we got a doubling. We're doubling the 5th in this case. And we're just doing that just for pure voice leading reasons. And if we did want to keep the same 6 notes, the kind of 6-note structure, or actually this is 1, 2, 3, 4. So this was only it was a 5-note. We could keep a 13 in there, right? We could go like that. Could just keep it as a common tone. So we could go. If we analyze, this is the sharp 11, this is the 9, this is the 7, this is the 5, 3, 1. And then we have 1, 5, 7, 3, 13, 9. We don't have an 11. We substitute the 13 for the 11. that would be 2. So but you could even, you could make it the 5th there. But the idea is that half step. So here's my basic rules for resolving upper structures. Move them by step or keep them as common tones whenever possible. Resolve things by half step over whole step whenever possible, which is why the C sharp up to the D works really well. Again, C sharp down to C natural would work, but there the problem is not the resolution, but the resolution of that voice, but the fact that we would go from a 6-note chord to a triad seems a little bit jarring. So hopefully that helps and gives you some stuff to work with. All right. We got someone here who's saying that a lot of this is over their head, but they're learning how to read music and get on board. This is awesome. I think, some people are afraid of knowledge, and I think that's a mistake. I think the more you learn, the more you can enjoy stuff, the more you can appreciate it, the deeper you can go. So sometimes you watch a video like this and you're like, man, everything's going over my head, but you now have these seeds in the back of your mind that are like, so the next time you hear the word secondary dominant or something like that, your brain is like primed to look for those things in the world. And it might help you as you're learning those things to pick them up faster. So sometimes you can expose to yourself the things that are just way over your head, and you only get, let's say, 5% of what person's talking about. But that other 95%, it's in the back of your head, and when you encounter it later on, you're a little bit more tuned in to grasp on it and try to understand it than you would if it was brand new, fresh for the first time. My best suggestion for people who are finding that a lot of this is going over your head is you can go back, start with lesson 1, work your way forward. We've got like 40 of those. I think I have now I have 83 videos up, and the first 40 are meant to be watched in order. So I have the first 40 or so are the lessons that are meant to be watched in order. So they build upon each other, and from simple to more difficult, et cetera, et cetera. And then I have the episodes, which are just different questions that I've kind of prepared ahead of time. And then I have the live Q&A, which is what we're doing right now. Those are kind of like the 3 different series that are up on my YouTube channel. So again, thanks for watching if you're new, and even if a lot of this is going over your head, the good news is you can go back to lesson 1, 2, 3, 4, and then just really, how to read music. You're going to learn so much stuff, and you're going to be primed to pick it up real fast by checking in with us right now. So welcome, and I hope you continue to follow and expand upon learning how to read music. All right, looking back at the chat. Fourth and 11th like to resolve down to the 3rd. Yeah, again, stepwise motion is always a thing that is you pretty much can't go wrong with smooth voice leading. And someone is saying in the chat that they've been taking voice lessons with a new teacher, so now can really read what I'm singing. Yeah, that's great. Good for you. I mean, there's stories of singers who don't know how to read music. I don't know if it's true, but Luciano Pavarotti, famous opera singer, reportedly doesn't know how to read music. Well, every now and then, you can still make it in music without knowing how to read music. And certainly certain pop styles, that's possible. But it's getting harder and harder to get by without reading music. It's like the history of jazz, where it's like when it starts off and it's brand new and people are experimenting, yeah, not so important. Now that it's developed and it's more of a mature art form, now it's really, really, really helpful when you're learning stuff to be able to read music. And people like Pavarotti had to pay a lot of money to have people help him learn how to learn a new piece of music. And there's certain things you just can't do. So my stance has always been, the more you know, the more skills you have, the better. So if you know how to read music and you have a great ear and can memorize, which Pavarotti did, you're going to be in really good shape. You're going to be able to, like, there's certain jobs Pavarotti never could do. Like, you're never going to hire him to do a sight reading gig for a TV commercial, where it's like, you come in, you record it, it's done. Like, you're not going to do that because his sight reading is not there. If you can do that and you can do the memorizing a roll and singing it, like, flexibility, right? So most of us are not going to be, you know, at the Metropolitan Opera every night or traveling the world and singing in opera houses. We're going to be putting our careers together by doing singing for a church gig, singing for a wedding, playing for, you know, and so our versatility is very beneficial for us to kind of build up skills and have a career. So good for you. And singing is great. I'm glad Caleb is talking about that. Having a bad time with certain intervals, can't sing them on the spot. Hey, what about Teoria.com? That's what I use with a lot of my students. Have some great exercises. You can practice intervals. You know, the best way for developing your ear is to use things like this to test yourself. And then for intervals, getting like popular songs that you know to help you with the intervals. So if you know, you go perfect fifth. So Twinkle Twinkle Little Star or ABCs, it starts off with a perfect fifth. Or Here Comes the Bride is a perfect fourth. And there's some great charts up online, so I'm not going to go through all of them here, but you can look up, you know, intervals and songs, you know, intervals and songs to help you learn them. You type something like that in, and you'll get a whole list. And then, if you know, and then that can help you identify the intervals. And then the next step is take a song that you really know really well, that you like, and figure out what interval it starts with, or where, if there's a certain spot in the song that has a unique interval, figure out what that spot is, and then you can be like, oh, it sounds like that song I love, and now I know what that interval is. This again ties into what I was saying earlier about transcribing, listening to something you love and writing it out. The idea is to connect what your ear has with what it looks like on a piece of paper written out. And so that, you know, you all have songs you love that you sing that are really crystal clear in your ear. And if you figure out what the intervals are in those songs and you write those melodies out and say, now I know that's called a whatever that interval is. Then when you hear it in a different context, it's going to help you have a label. You have a label for that sound now that you can apply in different contexts. Sometimes that label is the critical piece to transfer that knowledge to different pieces. So try that out and see if that helps you out. Someone else is writing, they find the more they force themselves to read music, the easier it gets. Doesn't being able to read music make you feel great about your accomplishment? Yeah, absolutely true. All right. What's the difference between a currante and corrento? I'm not quite sure the answer to that question. It might just be it's the same thing but in a different language, like Italian versus French. So maybe you do a Google search. That's what I would do if I were to look that up. What's the difference between the two? Probably nothing. Probably just different language. So I'm not quite sure why we have someone asking what the gayest chord is. I'm not sure if that's necessarily makes any sense to me. I remember I used to play games, and it's so interesting. Maybe what we're talking about 15 years ago, where saying, oh, that's so gay was considered an insult. It's less so considered an insult now. Probably want to just be careful with how you use that. I certainly don't want to insult anyone. There's a lot of amazing gay composers that I totally love and respect. So I would not want anyone to mistakenly think that I'm going to use that as a disparaging term. And I hope that's not the way you're intending to use it. So since I don't know what that question means, I'm going to skip that one. All right. Here's another one. What does it mean when someone says that the music is groovy? For example, when I listen to songs based on guitar riffs, I get a groovy feeling from the riff, but I don't get the same. For example, when I listen to songs based on guitar riffs, I get a groovy feeling from the riff, but I don't get the same. So, oh, groovy feeling from Bach. Okay, so groovy and the term. So groovy is a little bit of slang. So I think the reason you're not getting this, so yes, Bach is typically not very groovy, whereas a riff usually is. So groovy usually is going to be referring to that there's a steady beat. That's one aspect that's necessary, right? I don't think anything can be groovy without a steady beat. I don't think that term has ever been applied. I'm just thinking to myself. At least, and again, people use words. Sometimes people use words in a very sloppy way, so they kind of like make up their own definitions, and it's a word that, it applies to too many things. So if we're going to try to like get to like what most people mean when they say music is groovy, they're saying that it has a steady beat, and that there's a certain level of repetition. So like music in the 70s, and some music by Stevie Wonder and people like that, where you have like, especially like a repeated bass line or a repeated guitar riff. So it's the repetition that's critical. So think about groove. Back in the day, when recordings were done on records, LP, vinyl, right? And people talked about you basically would have a wax cylinder or wax disc, and you'd carve grooves into it that the needle on the phonograph would pick up, translate into pitch, rhythm, sounds, timbre, all of that. So the idea of a record with grooves that spins, right? It's a record, and it keeps spinning, right? There's this repetition, right? So if this spot goes, it's going to come back over here. And the needle kind of tracks from the outside to the inside, and then the record is done, right? So this idea of things circling back with repetition, and it's steady, right? Think about, I think the record is a great analogy. The speed of the record, 33 RPM, right? Versus the 45s. There's the different speed at how fast it turned. And the idea that it's coming back to that same spot, not the same spot in this direction, but the same spot, let's say here, as the record turns, comes back to this spot. So steady beat, a kind of a certain amount of repetition leads to the word groovy. Bach, in a lot of classical art music, isn't trying to be groovy. There's a few exceptions, right? There's sections, right? There's certain parts of Vivaldi and certain parts of Bach. Like Bach does his Passion, is it St. John's Passion? Yeah, St. John's Passion by Bach. There's a contrapuntal choral section that's talking about taking Jesus' clothing and dividing it. And it has like, it's like dun 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 ba ba ba, and it has all these, so it has this. The violins are like dugga 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 dugga, and the voices have this syncopation. It hits downbeat, and then has a bunch of upbeats in a row. So I would say that section of St. John's Passion counts as groovy. And there's certain parts of Vivaldi's Four Seasons that I would say count as groovy. But that would be like maybe 5% of classical music is groovy, and it's only in sections. Whereas more popular music tends to have more of a steady beat and more repetition. So I think in part it's a stylistic thing between the different styles. And just remember where when we're talking about older styles of music, people like Bach were writing music for the church. And although he's writing primarily for the Lutheran church, Protestant, like German Protestant church, that we have a church tradition that goes back to the Catholic Church. And keep in mind that the Catholic Church would not have wanted people getting groovy in the aisles during the church service. They did not want what you would find in, let's say, a Baptist church where people are clapping and dancing. They would have been like horrified, because the Catholic Church, again, going way back, right, to Middle Ages, Dark Ages, the idea was that the flesh and earthly pleasures were sinful, and that you really need to like stay away from those earthly pleasures, like dancing, and think about elevating your soul to the divine. So the soul is all about floating. Think about like ballet dancers and how they're up on the tip of the toe and it's kind of floating as opposed to stomping down towards the earth, more up towards heaven. And so from a philosophical, religious perspective, that the emphasis was for that more floating feeling. And so when you look at Bach and a lot of these Western European art music, it's coming out of that tradition. The Catholic Church was a huge patron of the arts, sponsored a ton of amazing music, but they didn't want that music to have a groovy feeling. Alrighty, hope that answers that question. All right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, you're absolutely right. Vivaldi's Winter is definitely as groovy as hell. I 100% agree with that. That's why you beat me to it, but you're 100% right. Let me go back here and make sure I have answer some other questions here. Okay. I love it when I get questions I don't know the answer to. Here's a question from Wayne. Are the Nashville numbering system and the Roman numeral system the same? I've never heard of the Nashville numbering system. So I'm going to write it down here, and I'm curious, because I don't know what that is. So hopefully I'll find out and get back to you. I appreciate all you giving me the thumbs up and that you appreciate what I'm doing. Thank you so much. It means a lot to me. It's one of the things that I look forward to when I wake up and I see a comment on YouTube or I do something like this. It's what keeps me going, keeps me excited about it. When, I've been thinking, and I think I've mentioned this, and I'll say it very quickly. I love playing jazz saxophone. When I was 18 years old, all I wanted to do was play jazz soprano saxophone. That's it. It's the only thing in the world I wanted to do. Now, I still want to play jazz soprano saxophone. Don't get me wrong, that has not changed. But there's other things I also want to do. And one of the things that is important to me now is that what I'm doing has an effect on other people. So I don't want to just play jazz soprano saxophone all by myself in a room to no one. I do that and I enjoy it. But I also want to do music that is helpful to other people. So you all letting me know that this stuff is helpful is the reason I'm still doing this. I started doing this 3 years ago, and I did not even dream that I would still be doing music theory 3 years from now. But because people like yourselves are saying, hey, we like this, we appreciate it, that's what I want to do with my music. I have certain knowledge that I love, that I feel passionate about. And if me sharing that is something that you all want to hear, that makes me happy. So thanks for the shout outs. I appreciate that, everybody. So thank you, M2J. I appreciate that. Let's see here. I got another one. I got a superficial glimpse of modes. Why we say C Mixolydian when it's G major 2. I don't know if I conveyed my confusion, but why we need modes when they are all after major scales. That's a good question. So this is from Anna, a question about modes. And I think Chig is answering this, which is pretty good. C Mixo has C as the center, while G major has G as the center, even though the notes are the same. There's some things here that are very right, and there's a couple things that are wrong. So let me clarify, because this is a good question. I do have a video up on modes, so you can look for that one. I think it's one of the episodes that I did talking about modes. Yeah, it was one of the episodes. So you can listen to that for more, but I'm happy to answer that right now. So C mixolydian is C, E, G, A, I'm sorry, what am I doing? C, D, E, F, G, A, B flat. So it is not coming from G major, it's coming from F major. So C mixolydian, the parent major scale is F major. G major, obviously, is spelled G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp. So, what would, and this is a quiz, you can put it in the chat. I'm quizzing you, that's my teacher side coming out. G major, so what is the mixolydian mode out of G major? Because G major and C mix are not connected. C mix and F major are connected. G major and what mix are connected? Go ahead, let's see if people can put this in the chat. Man, I don't think I can scroll down all the way to see it. Oh, there we go. That's better. Yeah. Yeah, Jake. You got it, Jake. Good job. Good. Yeah, it would be D mixolydian. But the question is still valid. Why do we have different names for F major and C mixolydian? Why? Why not just call it an F major scale starting on C? You could. You could do that. There's a couple reasons for this. One is tradition and history. So all the way back in ancient Greece, over 2,500 years ago, we're talking like 500 BC, people like Pythagoras wasn't just making theorems for triangles. People like Pythagoras and other Greeks from this time period were talking about music and trying to understand music. And they were saying, and they came up with these words, mixolydian, Dorian, Phrygian, and they had all these different scales. So they had these minor scales, Dorian, Phrygian, Aeolian, that they would use. They had major scales that they would use called Ionian and like Lydian and Mixolydian. And these were major scales that they used. So, but they didn't really have the major scale or the minor scale. That's something that happened way later in history. So we have an entire thousands of years, like 2,000 years, where we're dealing with what's called modal music, modality. And it's only in that Baroque era that we really get into tonality. Bach, Handel, this is when tonality comes, and they basically say we're going to pick one major scale to represent major, we're going to pick one minor scale, but we're going to alter it a little bit. So they're like, okay, we're going to go Ionian and Aeolian. Those are going to be our true representatives of major and minor, and we're going to do some tweaks to Aeolian because, we want to make it sound a little bit more like major sometimes. But we have this entire tradition and history going back for ancient Greece through antiquity, the Romans, the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, Renaissance, 2,000 years where we're talking about mixolydian. So when you say, well, why do we talk about mixolydian instead of just F major? F major happened way later than C mixolydian historically. So part of it is a recognition of that history. And the other is what Chig was talking about, about where the tonal center is, because, or where the gravitational pull is. So there's always a singular note. So there's one note that is like the central note that all other notes revolve around, where it feels the most relaxed. Again, music is all about tension and relaxation. So the most relaxed spot is one note. And then after you got that one note, you get a scale that goes along with that one note. But that one note is always more relaxed than any of the other notes, more central. So in an F major scale, you have F as your center, your most relaxed note. And for C mixolydian, you have C. The scale, the other notes that go along with it are the same, but it's not going to feel the same because that's the other component. So you got to remember that it's not just the notes themselves that are making up your scale, but the singular note that is the beginning and ending note is also critical. And that's what's different and why modes are different. They might all have the same notes in the scale, but their central note is what changes. And what that does is it creates different intervals above that central note. So if I have mixolydian, I've got a major second, I've got a major third, I've got a perfect fourth, a perfect fifth, a major sixth, and a minor seventh. Right? So if I'm playing these notes, that's your F major scale, but I go. That minor seven has a unique character to it. I'm going to play this exact same scale, but listen to how different this sounds. Just listen to how it feels different. I'm sorry, I don't want to do that one. I want to do this one. Did that feel different to you than the C mixolydian that I did just before? It feels different to me, right? So C mixolydian with these set of intervals above this bass that is your foundation feels very different to me than what I just did, which was put A as my foundation, which is a Phrygian mode. When A is the foundation, the intervals above A are not these. And those intervals, the different intervals, make different feelings. So that's why we have modes. That's why they're different. And it gives you a little bit of insight. So go watch my other video about it. Get some more insight and embrace the power of modes. I had no idea modes were so complicated till I went to the library at New York University and I was like, oh, here's a book about the music of William Byrd, who was a Renaissance composer. It's about modes. Oh, modes are pretty simple. Open up the book, and it's a book that's like this thick, and I would start reading it, I'm like going, oh my goodness, it's so complicated. I had no idea everything that went into modal music theory, which is something I'm just scratching like the most simplistic aspects of modal theory. The level and complexity that the medieval and Renaissance music theoreticians, Heinrich Glerian, Guido de Arezzo, some of these guys, Boethius, these folks were like, it was way more complicated, and I haven't spent the time to really delve in to be able to share with you what they were saying, but believe me when I say that it's far more complicated than you think. So anyways, enjoy. All right. All right. Let's see. So many questions, guys. I love it. But I'm starting to have a hard time keeping track of them all. So this is a great conversation. All right. So, guys, I love that you're answering each other's questions here in the chat. That is awesome because I just feel like I'm going to run out of time to answer everything here. So I appreciate you all helping each other. I think that's great. I'm going to try to get through a couple more questions before I wrap things up for today because it's amazing how fast time goes when you're having fun. It's like almost been 2 hours, and I don't feel like, it feels like 15 to me. So I'm going to take a few more questions. If I don't get to your question, my apologies. You know I love talking with you all about music theory. Come back in 2 weeks, and we can hope, if you still have that same question, well, I'm happy to pick it up. But let me see if I can get a little bit more before we wrap it up. So Adam, just to clarify, classical composers do use grooves and common rhythms we do today, just not just only in some of their music. There's some really groovy sections in Brahms, all of that stuff. They do. Also remember that classical composers aren't using percussion instruments in the way that we do today. Like there's very rarely, there's no drum set, right? And so although they sometimes will use a snare drum and bass drum and even cymbals, they're not used exactly the same way as you use a drum set today. And even when they're using those instruments, they're usually not used for the entire piece. Most of the times when we're talking about groovy music today, the drums are at the beginning and they're through the entire song. That's really rare in classical music. Even if like Tchaikovsky uses a snare drum or Shostakovich uses a snare drum, it's usually not for the whole piece. Listen to Ravel's Bolero. That's kind of a weird, unusual groove. But that's one where the snare drum is used, I think, throughout. But it happens. It's just that it's so uncommon that I understand why you say what you're saying there. Let's see here. Bach's St. John's Passion is the first metal song. I don't think so. You got to listen to some Guillaume Marchot. Listen to Guillaume Marchot. Some of his stuff is like metal. Toccata and Fugue, D minor is metal. Yes, I would agree with that. Has that feeling. All right, folks. I had a blast working with you all here and chatting. The last thing I saw was something about Stephen Sondheim. Yeah, Stephen Sondheim and some of the Broadway musical theater composers, hugely underrated. I agree 100%. So Stephen Sondheim, so here's what my thoughts on Stephen Sondheim. I think he's brilliant, brilliant composer. I think that I'm really glad that I don't feel like Stephen Sondheim feels. I think Stephen Sondheim is a much more tortured, unhappy person than I am. This might be me being super, super pretentious and presumptuous. So, Stephen Sondheim, if you watch this, please forgive me. I love your music. I think you're amazing. But if you listen to the musicals he does, some of it's really depressing stuff. And I think that's coming from his experiences. He is a gay composer. Being gay has not always been easy. Sometimes it's been downright really, really hard. So the fact that that's the way he feels and that's reflected in his music, I think is understandable. And that's why I say, thank goodness, in general, I feel a lot more optimistic than Stephen Sondheim feels. And there's some reasons for that. So it's not a criticism, it's more of an observation. But amazing composer. The sophistication of his writing is like masterful. His use of upper structures and harmonies, exquisite. Now what's interesting is that he does not normally do his own orchestration. So he'll write the music, but all the different use of the instruments and how they're put together, it's usually someone else. And I can't remember the name of the person, but they deserve a ton of credit for Stephen Sondheim's sound. I'll leave you with this one last quick story. So my wife is big into musical theater. That's like her specialty as a musician. And I was watching a documentary. It was a parody of a documentary of Stephen Sondheim's cast recording of Company. So there's a documentary on his show Company. And there's a parody. I think it's called a group called Documentary Now. And I think this is on I don't know if it's on Amazon Prime or Netflix. I think it's like one of those things. But it's a parody of that. And I never saw the documentary. I hadn't ever seen the documentary. I've watched the show and I've heard the recording of Company. There's some amazing music in there. But I never saw the documentary. And then I saw the parody and I was like, this is just kind of goofy and silly. Oh, okay. That's kind of funny. And then I watched the actual documentary of Company. And after I watched the parody, and I laughed so hard at the documentary, the actual documentary, because I had watched the parody first. So if you're interested in Stephen Sondheim, I would recommend both of these. And I'm not sure which is the right order to watch them. I did the parody first and then the documentary, and I laughed really hard. Most people would, obviously watch the original that the parody is about in that order. But yeah, and Stephen Sondheim is amazing. And I actually had an opportunity to hear him speak live. He was interviewed by Leonard Bernstein's daughter at a opera festival I went to, and I got to hear him talk about music and some of his experiences. And man, I would love to hang out and talk with Stephen Sondheim. The stories this guy has from all of his experiences and the amazing people he's been associated with, studying with some of the greats from the early musical theater world to associations with people like Leonard Bernstein. Just an amazing career and an amazing composer. So I leave you with that. Thank you, everybody. Hope you have a great couple of weeks and hope to see you next time. Thanks so much.